A lot of these texts are from an ancient oral tradition, so they were memorized and performed. And when I think of that, it makes me kind of love the book of Jonah. It's not a historical report, it's ancient satire. And it's hilarious. We have a prophet who's not acting so much like a prophet. In fact, when the first time God asked Jonah to go cry out against Nineveh, neither one of them run through this whole call narrative saga. There's no divine appearance. God doesn't have any introduction words. God just goes straight to the call. And then Jonah, instead of objecting like he's supposed to, so that God can then reassure and give some sort of divine reassuring sign, Jonah just runs away. He tries to put as much distance between him and God as possible, even hopping on a ship to put an entire body of water between him and what God has called him to do. Now, the ancient Israelite audience would have found it highly unusual for a prophet to act in this way, but they would have had some sympathy because anyone who knew Nineveh knew that it was the capital of Neo-Assyria, which was known for its merciless brutality and was known as a bloodthirsty empire. But going to that extreme to get away from one's call still would have been downright humorous to them. I don't know what the ancient storyteller version would have looked like, but I imagine in my head it's some sort of Benny Hill type chase scene. It's like da 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 da, like they're just like running, or it's the cartoon character who dissolves into a puff of smoke as they start running. I think it's like that absurd that it's laughable. And everyone generally remembers the next part, right? Like Jonah is thrown overboard by these God-fearing foreign sailors and swallowed by a large fish. He remains in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights while he gets himself together. It's a little bit of a divine timeout, if you will. And at the end of it, he surrenders to his call, and the fish unceremoniously spits him up onto the shore, you know, kind of like a cat with a hairball. Exactly. Exactly. I personally always think of Puss in Boots from Shrek. But if you need some sort of image help, YouTube is very helpful with that, I learned. But that brings us to our passage for tonight. The word came again to Jonah, telling him to go to Nineveh and to give them God's message. Well, this time, Jonah did not wait for fear to talk him out of it. The very next verse, he's on his way. Here, the storyteller takes another moment to mention how exceedingly large the city is. It's a 3 days walk across, right? But at that point is another moment where the ancient Israelite audience would have gotten a chuckle, because the city of Nineveh was only about 3 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. So it's like if I said, I just had the biggest lunch, guys. I had like 4 M&Ms. They were peanut M&Ms. Now, in my hermeneutical imagination, I suppose it to be poking fun at Nineveh's size. But now that I've lived in New York for so long, I could see how maybe they could be making fun of their overcrowdedness. Anyone who's attempted to walk from 34th Street to 59th Street in the summer with the tourists who were all walking slowly and looking up, you know what I'm talking about, right? It could take a day to get that 1 mile, am I right? So Jonah walks into the city for about a day and shouts, "Y'all got 40 days." Drops the mic, walks out. He doesn't give the message God gave him in the beginning of chapter 1. Instead, he says, none of this will be here in 40 days. He even skips over the preliminary, "Thus said the Lord," that other prophets are always careful to include. But despite Jonah's prophetic missteps, the people of Nineveh know what's up. They believed God and immediately proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he didn't mess around either. It says he got up from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. All of this, the actions of both the people and the king, were part of a traditional Israelite ritual of penitence. So the people that Jonah had spent so much time disliking and in fear of, and the ancient Israelite audience as well, those people were actually doing the same things that the Israelite audience would be doing if they were repenting. That's the thing about satire. Though it's humorous, it's generally constructive social critique. Here we have an Israelite prophet who can't seem to get anything right when it comes to God, but we have these Assyrians who are nailing it. This ancient Israelite audience probably would have squirmed in their seat a little bit at this point. But this crafty storyteller didn't let the humor drop for long. In the very next verse, the king picks up where Jonah left off and even takes it a bit further. He has a proclamation made in Nineveh that not only were all human beings required to fast, but all animals as well. Not only were human beings to wear sackcloth, but all animals as well. So all of the sheep, all of the birds, and I don't know what they did with the poor fish. Not only were humans to cry out mightily to God, but all animals as well. This is a very thorough king. He's making sure all of his T's are crossed, all of his I's are dotted. And the image of an entire pasture filled with sheep wearing sackcloth and crying out to God would have made the audience snicker. Exactly. The king continues by telling all to turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their very hands. Who knows, he says, maybe God will change God's mind and we won't die. And that's exactly what happens in the next verse. God sees what they did and decided not to bring the calamity God had intended. The beauty of this well-crafted satirical piece is that it is a teaching fable. Biblical scholar Marcia C. Wright wrote a commentary on this piece where she reflects that the author's tactic was to unhinge the audience's expectations. So you have a prophet that tries to run away. You have foreigners acting like Israelites, a king that steps into the role of a prophet to finish God's call, and you have the most wicked city imaginable repenting on a massive scale. By destabilizing the ancient hearers of this text, possibly people whose rigid notion of divine justice has led them into self-righteous despair, the author prepared them to receive a radical message of God's compassion. A theology of repentance that had only previously been applied to Israelites was now applied to those outside of the chosen people. This is what the audience would have had to wrestle with as the story came to an end and as they went on their journeys home. Nadia Bolz-Weber writes about inclusion in her book Pastrix. It's a word that rubs me the wrong way, and Nadia does a great job of helping me figure out why. She writes, "This desire to learn what the faith is from those who have lived it in the face of being told they are not welcome or worthy is far more than inclusion. Actually, inclusion isn't the right word at all, because it sounds like in our niceness and virtue, we are allowing them to join us. Like we are judging another group of people to be worthy of inclusion in a tent that we don't own." MLK Day, just having passed, reminds me that we have seen this sort of false inclusion before. It reminds me of the struggle against Jim Crow laws during the 60s. It looks like buses where some people are only allowed certain seats, and bathrooms and water fountains for certain people and a separate set for others. It reminds me of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It looks like what the storyteller calls the violence that is in their hands, the violence that was in their very actions. Intended or not, it was there. What's in your hand? Nadia goes on to write that thinking it was her job to widen the tent was misguided, as it's not her tent, it's God's tent. The wideness of the tent is only her concern insofar as it points to the gracious nature of a loving and merciful God who welcomes all, who has in hand compassion and truth and light and love. What's in your hand? Now, we learn through this passage that we might not get it right the first time. This was Jonah's second attempt. And it took him 3 days and 3 nights inside of a fish to deal with his stuff. You know, the stuff. That stuff that's in you that you try to avoid about yourself. That stuff that separates you from a sincere connection with the divine that is in you and is around you. For Jonah, it was fear. But the Assyrians in this story are aware of what's inside of them and are willing to face their stuff immediately. They turn from their evil ways and from the violence in their hands. They were so terrible that they were given 40 whole days to turn it around, but they didn't even end up needing one. What if we all recognized our collective stuff? What if we challenged ourselves to notice how far this tent stretches? What if we emptied our hands of the polite but patronizing email responses or the condescending Facebook posts? What if instead we filled our hands with words of hope and love? What if that's what we had in our hands? Jonah only had to say, "You've got 40 days," and immediately Nineveh began to act. They knew where they were not congruent with God, and they immediately shifted. We live in a society where children are killed by those who are supposed to protect them, where claiming a religion can get you labeled a terrorist, where 200 little girls can one day not come home from school. These are the things we're holding, all of us, in our city, in our state, in our country, in our world. How do we respond? How do we act? What do we give? In his I Have a Dream speech, King talks about the fierce urgency of now. The Assyrian society that was so terrible turned it around immediately. They put down the violence that was in their hands and picked up a whole new way of life. Last year, to honor MLK Day, a blacksmith turned a gun into a farming tool right in the middle of church service. Sparks were flying everywhere. This was a symbolic turn from the violence in our collective hands in order to pick up something that can be used to immediately change our environment. What's in our hands? As we're thinking about what's in our hands, or essentially what our actions are towards helping to create a world that reflects God's kingdom, a free and just society, we should notice the actions of the words in this passage. Only one person actually speaks in this passage, and it's Jonah, and it's short. It's only half a verse long. He only goes a third of the way into the city to give his portion of the message. In all of the other instances, words do all the work in this passage. The word of the Lord came, the news reached the king, and a proclamation was made. This illustrates the activity of these words on their own. They carry their own power. There's power to change, and there's power to leave a mark. We've all seen instances where words have hurt, and we know instances where words have healed. Once those words leave our lips, or for a lot of us now who are attached to our smartphones, once those words leave our hands, where will they go? What will they do? Are they continuing violence, or are they continuing a work of change? When the people of Nineveh changed their actions, it was also changing their relationship with God. They then aligned themselves with God. So let us do the same. Let us continue to align ourselves with God and God's work. Let us interrogate ourselves to find the things inside that distance us from an authentic relationship with God. Then and only then will we be able to answer the question, what's in our hands? Then and only then will we be able to put down the violence that is in our hands and pick up instruments of change. Church, I pray that we answer this question together and with the fierce urgency of now. What's in your hand?